Hi, I'm Taylor. Welcome to my channel, where I talk about my life as an expat in Malaysia. Today, I want to talk to you about the cost of living in Malaysia. Stick around. I think you'll be surprised. As an overview, the cost of living in Malaysia is about 25% of what it is in the United States. That makes it very attractive for retirees living on a fixed income like me. As I've mentioned before, I couldn't possibly have retired in the US, and when I found Malaysia, I found it was an ideal choice for me. Almost everyone speaks English, which is a real plus, and the cost of living is a fraction of what it is in the United States. So today, I'm going to give a quick overview of the general cost of living in Malaysia, including housing, transportation, food, medical, and entertainment. First of all, I want to say that I have a fixed income of $2,000 US per month to live on. Now that sounds like nothing in the US, and you would probably have a very, very poor standard of living. $2,000 a month in Malaysia is plenty, as I'll show you. First of all, housing. Now there's all kinds of prices for housing, just like anywhere else in the world. You could spend anywhere from, $300 a month up to several $1,000s a month, just depending on what you want. But I think I'm sort of in the middle of what I can afford for a typical expat here. The $500 a month range or so. That's what I've been able to do. The first place I lived in Malaysia was a 3-bedroom apartment on the 35th floor, and that was $500 a month. I just lived there a year for reasons I've gone into in other videos. The second place I lived in Malaysia, and that was in Penang, was about $700 a month. It was a bit of a splurge, and it was much nicer than the first one, but there were things that I didn't like. I eventually got another apartment in the same building for $500 a month again, and I liked it much better. So you can see, I've tried to keep to the 25% of my monthly income for my housing, and that works out pretty well, I tell you that. I now live in Kuala Lumpur, and I have a smaller unit because I realized after living for 7 years in 3-bedroom apartments that I simply don't need 3-bedroom apartments. You think that people are going to come and visit you when you're living in an exotic place like this, but very few do. I've had only a couple of visitors over the 7 years. So when I moved to KL, I decided I was going to get something that was just more manageable size-wise. And I'm going to give a complete tour of the apartment in another video. The one I ended up with, though, is a 2-floor loft apartment with the loft bedroom upstairs and the living room, dining room, and kitchen downstairs. And it's about, well, they said it's 910 square feet, but they're including the airspace. So it's really 810 square feet. But 810 square feet is a good amount of space for a 1-bedroom. And it's got gorgeous views. I'm on the 27th floor, a 22-foot high wall of glass overlooking the city, and I pay $410 a month. Now, I have friends that pay much more for apartments, and they're much more glamorous, bathtubs, which is a big thing for me, and most places don't have bathtubs here unless they are really, really high-end. And you don't get dishwashers usually either. Almost every place has a washing machine, and my new place has a combo washer and dryer, which works out just fine for me. Electricity, I would say less expensive than the US too. Now, the one apartment I had that was faced west and had horrible sun all afternoon, I paid upwards of $150 a month for the electric bill. The next place I moved that had northern exposure, it was much less, more like 100 or less. Now, for some reason, I think it's partly because it's a newer apartment and the air conditioning is more efficient, I only pay about $60 a month for electric, and that's awesome. As a tenant, you pay for your own water in Malaysia too. Now in Penang, it was incredibly cheap, and I think it's possibly because they have huge reservoirs there and water is very plentiful. We get a lot of rain here, and I think that probably accounts for it. In Penang, I was paying $5 every 3 months for water. That's just amazing. Now in Kuala Lumpur, it's a little bit more expensive, and I pay $7.50 every month. So you can see that's a huge increase, but still extremely affordable. Another expense I have here is broadband. And we have fiber optic. I've had fiber optic in every apartment I've lived in here, which is light years ahead of a lot of places in the US. The broadband costs about $35 a month, which is a steal. And the only other expense I have for the apartment is Netflix, which is an additional $10 a month. Food runs the gamut in Malaysia. You can spend very little money for very good quality food, particularly if you go out. It's probably the only place I've lived where it does seem actually less expensive to eat out rather than cook your own food. You can go to a mamak, which is just a very casual eating place, and have something for around $5. The restaurants are a little bit more expensive, nicer restaurants anyway, and they can run you $25 for 2 people for a nice meal, probably with a beer with that. Now, I live in a building that has a village grocer on the ground floor, which is extremely convenient. I can go to the grocery store without ever getting wet if it's raining or anything. And it's a lovely store. It's very much like Whole Foods in the United States. So, and like Whole Foods, it's one of the more expensive grocery stores in Malaysia. I eat very well, as you can probably tell. And so that's one of my major expenses. And I spend about $500 a month on food, groceries, and eating out, which isn't too bad, but it's a lot for Malaysia standards. Getting around isn't too bad. Transportation costs are pretty reasonable, although they've gone up lately. And like most places in the world, inflation is hitting us here too. They have a service that's like Uber here called Grab. You can go a few kilometers for $1 or $2, so that's not bad. But the price fluctuates wildly. So it's better if you can afford to have your own car. I happen to have a Vespa, which I adore, and it's so inexpensive to run. The insurance and road taxes on the Vespa are about $100 a year. And I can fill up the tank for $2.50, and that lasts me at least 2 weeks, if not more. I don't go around a lot because traffic's pretty bad here. I'm really happy using a scooter here. Now, a lot of people might not be because the traffic's pretty wild, but I've always been a good driver, and I'm still pretty nimble for my age. So I love my Vespa, which I've named Vicky. A food-related expense is alcohol. Now that's the big rub here in Malaysia. As you probably know, Malaysia is a majority Muslim country, so they tax alcohol heavily. It's ridiculous. You have to pay about $60 for a liter of gin. Good quality, of course, but still, that's so much more than it is in the United States. It's unbelievable. If you buy beer for your house, it's $3 to $5 a can. If you eat out, a pint of beer will cost you about $7.50, and a cocktail at least $10. Now that may not seem like a lot because that's probably similar to what you pay in the United States, but compared to the cost of the food, where you probably get an entire meal for less than the cost of your cocktail, that just shows you how inflated the prices are. The other major expense I have, which is not a major expense, but it's a necessity, particularly for my age, is my health insurance. Now, I pay $85 a month for that, and the coverage, honestly, isn't that great. It only really covers hospitalization, and it has a really low cap per lifetime. It's a term health insurance policy, which means that it only lasts until I'm 80. And after that, I guess I'm just on my own. I do see a doctor regularly. I've had a little bit of cosmetic surgery, and the costs are far, far less than in the United States. I'm going to cover all that in another video in more detail about medical costs. An expense associated with medical is medications. I have a slight heart problem, and the medications cost me about $150 a month. Now that's probably not a lot compared to what it would be in the United States, but it's a pretty big hunk here. I also have my apartment cleaned once a week. That costs about $60 a month, believe it or not. My cell phone costs about $30 a month, and it has excellent, excellent coverage. So my basic expenses come out to $1,347.50. So that gives me about $700 a month mad money, which is plenty for me, although you can always use more, but basically I do fine. In a future video, I'll get more in depth in some of these areas, but for now, I think that'll give you a pretty good overview of the cost of living in Malaysia. As always, if you like this video, please like and subscribe, and tune back in another time because I have plenty more fascinating information of expat life in Malaysia. Talk to you later. Bye.